Quick disclaimer. This podcast is for educational purposes only. Always consult your certified flight instructor, aircraft manuals, and current regulations before applying any of the techniques or interpretations discussed here.
Hello, and welcome to Helicopter Training Podcast, Episode 1. In this episode, we're going to talk about how to become a helicopter pilot. And don't forget, you can also watch a video version of the episode on YouTube Podcasts, or just follow along with the visuals on your podcast player if it supports them. The focus in this episode is mainly going to be US-based or FAA-based pathways. So if you're listening from somewhere else, send us in how it's different in your country. We're going to go through some common questions like, what are the age, education, and medical requirements? What is the typical path and how long does it take? We're going to talk about what does it cost and what financing options are available, including veterans benefits. How to choose a flight school and pick the right airframe. How to get started with some resources, tips, and more. Now, for those of you already doing this, tell us what you wish you'd known when you were trying to work out how to get started. And then the next episode might be more for you, which is going to be talking about how to hover, tips, etc. Okay, let's get started. One of the first questions I get when I tell people what I do, they say, is it hard to become a helicopter pilot? And to be honest, in a word, yes. Yes, it is. To fly a plane, to learn to fly a plane, a lot easier. To become a professional pilot, whether you're an airplane or a helicopter pilot, that takes quite a lot of work. But I think to become a helicopter pilot is kind of another level above that. And we'll sort of talk about some of the reasons why. Now, to start with, if you're going to be a pilot of any kind, there's a lot of book work and there's some exams. You're going to be doing a lot of studying. I'd say maybe 80-20. For every 20 hours of flight, you would have spent 80 hours studying. It's intensive. There's a lot of book work. Then you've got books like the Helicopter Flying Handbook, which I think most people would probably enjoy to read. But then you have the FAR-AIM, which is all about regulations. I remember the first time someone gave me the FAR-AIM, and I looked at it and I thought this was flying helicopters, not becoming a lawyer. Good news is you don't have to learn all of it, but there is a lot of study, yeah. So you've got the Helicopter Flying Handbook, the FAR-AIM, the PHAK, which is the Pilot Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. You don't just turn up and fly. I think that's a surprise for a lot of people. That's the fun stuff, but there's a lot of study that's going on. The exams, you have pre-solo tests, you have stage checks, you have knowledge tests. I think it's worse in Europe. I think they have to do 9 written tests just for their private pilot. Then we have the pressure of the check ride and getting through the check ride. But don't get me wrong, you don't have to be a genius. I was not an A student when I was in high school, but you do have to have a commitment to study, even the stuff that's not fun. As I said, it's a little bit harder than flying an airplane. There's a lot more coordination, fine motor movement, and multitasking in helicopter flying than, say, learning to fly in the Cessna 172. I teach a class up at college, and every term I see people who are dedicated to study, they're smart, they work hard, and then they really struggle to fly. Now, those people will get there too. They usually do. Most people can fly the helicopter. Most people will get to hover. It will be the people that who have come with previous experience of skills, things like maybe they've worked heavy machinery. Those kind of people tend to do very well at learning to fly, and hopefully they'll back that up with the studying. Other people, they may be really good at what they did before, and then they come to fly helicopters, and it's very humbling. They have to remember this is a brand new skill. It takes a little bit, and it can be frustrating. Now, there's the obvious cost. Flying helicopters is not cheap, and we'll dive into that in a little bit more detail later on. Like I said, you've got to be committed to study. You've got to dedicate yourself to doing this. You can't really dabble in learning to fly helicopters. You really need to commit for success. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to commit 2 years of your life with no breaks. There's plenty of people who do a rating, they get a private pilot, and then they go and work for a bit, build up their money. That can work too. But when you're studying, when you're working towards it, it's got to be your thing. Now, in becoming a pilot, there's going to be failures. There's going to be good days and bad days. You're going to feel frustrated. You're going to fail a check ride maybe, or fail a stage check. that is part of the learning process. And, a failure can be a great lesson and motivate you to push harder. I was talking to Kenny Keller of Helicopter Online Ground School about when he failed his first private pilot check ride and how that could have ended his helicopter flying. And instead, it ended up kind of pushing him to obviously do very well. And I'll put a link in the description to that video. So, is it hard? Yes. But with dedication, hard work, and a bit of money, you can do it. And I'm going to help you. What are the age requirements to become a helicopter pilot? In the US, the minimum age for a student pilot certificate and to solo is 16 for helicopters. Now, supposedly it's 15 to take the knowledge test according to this FAA website. I hadn't seen that before. But you can start training before 16, and you can log that training in a logbook without a student pilot certificate. But there's not much point in starting much earlier than that, because you're going to be held back not being able to solo, and you need to kind of hold that momentum, keep moving forward. So I'd say realistically, 15 is probably the earliest you really would want to start with something like this, at earliest. Then to actually take your private pilot check ride in helicopters, you have to be 17. And in the US, to take your commercial check ride or your certified flight instructor CFII, you have to be 18 years old. And then if we were going to go all the way through to ATP, for the helicopter, you'd have to be 23 years old for helicopter ATP. We'll talk about what that is later on, airline transport pilot. There's no maximum age for a helicopter pilot unless they were flying under Part 121 as a scheduled airliner. I don't know if that's a thing for helicopters. But the thing about all of this is you've got to have a medical of some sort, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So although there isn't technically, say, an age where you can't become a helicopter pilot anymore, if you can't maintain a medical certificate, that may be the limiting factor. So what are the education requirements to become a helicopter pilot? Well, there isn't really any formal education requirements. But if English isn't your first language, you will have to demonstrate a certain level of English proficiency, reading, writing, speaking, listening, etc., which makes sense, of course. The aviation language is English across the world, and we need critical pieces of information, air traffic control instructions, etc., have to be fully understood. And there's a whole advisory circular I'll put a link in the description for. You can find out more information on that. So I was a C-grade high school student, and then I barely passed my degree that I took in my early 20s. I was not really interested in the subject. When I started flying in my early 30s, I got an aviation degree, and by that point I'd kind of worked out how to study, and I was obviously interested in the subject, and I ended up with a 4.0. It's not so much the education as just having good study skills, and we could do a whole episode on what that means. But it's things like, writing things down, reading ahead, asking questions. Although there is no math requirement, there is some basic mental math skills that you will need to have. You'd have to do things like weight and balance calculations or fuel planning, navigation. There could be things like, hey, this aircraft burns 10 gallons per hour. We need to fly for this diversion for 15 minutes based on our ground speed. How much fuel is that going to take? That kind of thing is checked on a check ride. So that is something, if you think you might be weak at that, that's something you would be able to practice on your own, run some scenarios to try and get some basic rules of thumb for your aircraft. I'm not particularly awesome at mental math under pressure of flying, so I again use some basic rules of thumb that make it as easy as it can be. And again, those are the kind of things that we'll get into in this podcast. Another thing to point out is when you take your written test or your knowledge test, you are allowed to use calculators and something called an E6B, which is a pretty amazing calculator that can work out all sorts of things for you. So you don't have to memorize a bunch of formulas or struggle with some of the more complicated math. So although you don't need a degree, I would say it's not a bad idea to have one, particularly not a bad idea to have maybe a non-aviation degree as a backup if you do end up losing your medical. Another thing about this is if you are going to partner this up with getting an aviation degree, that can also help you get access to funding, which we're going to talk about later. Particularly if you're a veteran, that makes a huge difference to how you can fund this. Another thing about doing an aviation degree, it'll give you a wider and deeper level of knowledge going to class will reinforce the things that you're seeing at the flight school. It also helps build study groups and friendships with others that are kind of going through the same thing at the same time. And at the end of the day, having a degree on your resume for any job can only help. Some flight schools that are partnered up with college programs may require their instructors to have a degree as part of working for the college. So that's something else to consider. So what are the medical requirements to fly a helicopter in the US? Most helicopter flying in the US is going to require some sort of FAA medical or basic med. They're going to be looking at your vision, your hearing, heart, lung function, medical history, mental illness, medications used, etc. There's 3 levels of FAA medical. The first highest level is first class medical. That would be for someone using airline transport pilot privileges. So that would be things like flying for the airlines, big aircraft. Now, there may be some situations where a particular employer or a contract might require a higher level of medical. So, for example, I think some of the big oil companies in the Gulf of Mexico, if I remember right, they required the pilots flying for them to have a first-class medical and an ATP. Second-class medical is for most commercial operations. To go earn money and use your commercial certificate, you're usually required to have a second-class medical. We require our instructors to have that level medical because although instructing doesn't require a second-class medical, we do get our instructors to do other paid work that would require them to have a second-class medical. The third-class medical is for non-commercial operations, so that your private pilot certificate or recreation pilot certificate privileges. Also, if you're an instructor, you can instruct under third-class medical. The last option is basic med, which is a relatively new standard of medical requirements. There's restrictions. It's for less than 12,500 pounds, maximum 7 seats. Can actually be paid as an instructor under basic med. But there's other restrictions like no previous denial of medical, have a valid driver's license. You have to see a doctor. It doesn't have to be an air medical examiner for initial comprehensive medical examination checklist or CMEC. And then you do a biannual online course, which is about an hour. That's usually free to do that course. And a checkup every 4 years. AOPA has a good website that walks you through all this. Now, depending on your age and which class you're trying to maintain, you have to renew somewhere between every 6 months to every 5 years. So, for example, if you're maintaining a first-class medical and you're above 40, you'd have to do that every 6 months. At the other end, if you are doing a third-class medical and you're under 40, you'd have to renew every 5 years. Now, commercial privileges, like I said, require a second class, and we get our instructors to maintain that level, and that's every 1 year, regardless of age. I'll put links in the description of more information on FAA medicals, including that AOPA link, and also a locator to find an air medical examiner near you. I would say make sure you can get a medical before committing to learning to fly. So that would be part of the process, is go get a medical. Third class or second class is fine before you throw down all the money and quit your job to learn to fly. It's really important you stay healthy as a pilot. It's a stressful event for everyone when they go and renew their medical, because without medical, for a lot of people, that ends their flying career. Oh, another personal tip, get your vision checked before you go take your medical. A few years back, I went in and took my medical exam, and one of the pieces is a vision check. And I was really struggling, and I was stressing because I was struggling, and that was making it worse. So from that point on, I always book an eye check about 3 months before. So if there's any changes to my vision, I have time to get glasses, etc., and not fail my medical. Another common question is, can I become a helicopter pilot if I have a medical condition or previous injury? Well, my suggestion is you discuss that with an air medical examiner before you actually take the formal medical exam. Make sure then that you have all the necessary documentation, so test results, diagnosis, etc. And you may have to get what's called a special issuance. I'd get all that kind of squared away before you go and attempt your medical exam. That avoids wasting time and then getting a denial. Also, don't lie, especially if you're claiming disability benefits as a veteran. In the last few years, the Veterans Database for Disabilities and the FAA medical databases have been cross-checking each other, and I know of quite a few veterans who had their medicals suspended when the FAA medical team realized that they had claimed for disability as veterans but hadn't put that on their medical exam paperwork. So don't get caught up in that. Full details of all the FAA medical standards is in Part 67. And again, I'll put a link in there. This is from the FAA's website. It talks about what medical conditions does the FAA consider disqualifying. And it gives a list, but it also says, however, in many cases, when the condition is adequately controlled, the FAA will issue a certificate contingent on periodic reports. An example of a special issuance might be something like someone who's colorblind. I know a friend who was colorblind, which could be a no-go for being a pilot, and you have to do a special issuance which involves more time and paperwork and tests. And one of the things he had to do was go up in an aircraft and then receive light gun signals from an air traffic control tower with an examiner sat next to them to confirm they could tell the difference between green and red. And if you fail that test, that's it. You don't get to do that again. That's a one-time thing. So that was quite a stressful flight for him. But he got a special issuance and he has a medical and he works as a pilot. Quick update. While I was putting together this show, I was listening to Max Trescott's Aviation News Talk, and he was talking to Dr. Caldwell about changes that have happened to the vision tests. Effective January 2025, these pretty plates, which are called Ishihara plates, those are no longer used because they can be memorized. So now the medical exam will use digital testing for both red and green color deficiency, but also yellow and blue deficiency. Anyone who already has a medical will be grandfathered in, but those that may have some change in their medications or any kind of illness that might affect color vision would have to have one of these new color tests performed. This all happened because there was an accident, and NTSB investigated and found that this FedEx accident in Tallahassee, Florida in 2002, the first officer had a color vision deficiency and misinterpreted the runway approach lighting system. So this is originally I got this from the Aviation News Talk, which is a great podcast. I'm a Patreon supporter and a contributor to the show. It's more leaning towards fixed wing, but now the host, Max, is also a helicopter pilot, so you hear a lot more helicopter content as well. So I highly recommend that, and again, I'll put you guys a link in the description for that. If you want to become a helicopter pilot in the US, do you need US citizenship? Well, it is easier if you are a US citizen and you prove your citizenship as you start flight training with either a passport or a combination of birth certificate, normalization certificate, and government photo ID. If that's not the case, then you have to go through the TSA clearance. And this is what I did before I became a US citizen. Back then, it was called the AFSP, or Alien Flight Student Program. Earlier in 2024, it became the Flight Training Security Program. Obviously, TSA was a response to the 9/11 attacks, creating new security checks for flight training. So the check itself would involve submitting personal information, training details, you have to give fingerprints, then you go through a security threat assessment, and there's a fee of about $140. This only applies to certain pilot certifications, so private instrument doesn't apply to commercial CFI or CFII, for example. Your flight school would help work this out with you, and they'll be part of that process. Also, if you're not a US citizen, do you need a visa? There's M1 and F1 visas. There's a bit more detail than we're going to go to into this in this podcast, but that's something else to be considering. If you're in this situation where you're not a US citizen, I would get in touch with the flight school you're considering going through. A good flight school will help guide you through this process, and that's what happened to me when I first came to the US and did my training. So let's talk about the pathway to becoming a helicopter pilot in the US. There is something called a sport rating or a sports certificate. It is pretty limited in terms of weight of aircraft. It's daytime only, VFR, only one passenger, no commercial operations, but it's also only for gyroplanes, not for helicopters, so that's not an option. The next level up is something called a recreational certificate. It also has a bunch of restrictions. It's day only, one passenger, within 50 miles of your home airport with endorsements and maximum 4 seats, a little bit more of a weight limit, has some altitude and airspeed restrictions. I think the stats here speak for themselves about this. This is the estimated active pilot certificates being held by class as of December 31st, 2023. There were over 800,000 pilots in total. About 13,500 were helicopter, and of those, it is estimated that one of those was a recreational helicopter pilot. For most, it is going to be best to start with your private pilot certificate for the helicopter. Now we're going to go through the steps just as a quick overview, and we'll dive into each rating and certificate later on. So first of all, the private pilot certificate would take typically somewhere between 3 to 6 months. Then they'd go get their instrument rating, again typically 3 to 6 months. Commercial, roughly the same, 3 to 6 months. And then CFI, which is Certified Flight Instructor, and Certified Flight Instructor with Instrument Rating, those two together would probably take about 3 to 6 months. I mean, all these things are just averages. For example, I ended up doing my CFII in 2 weeks. So some things to think about, some factors that affect progress. The instructor and student availability, aircraft availability, unscheduled maintenance, weather, the instructor leaving and you having to kind of reset a little bit with a new instructor, work commitments, illness, life. There's lots of things that get in the way. So make sure that you can commit when you're there. Make sure your instructor and the school can do the same. There are accelerated courses, and they can work out if you have a really solid ground, either through self-study or something like the Helicopter Online Ground School. But if you're not doing an accelerated course, you're typically looking to fly 3 times a week with lots of study in between. Things change a little bit when you get into CFI and CFII, but that's kind of the rough numbers to start with. But at the end of the day, remember, it's not a race. I have every term, I have students come into a Helicopter Foundations or Fundamentals course. It's their first term, and there's the inevitable looking left and right when I ask questions like, who's got into hovering and who's got that mastered and who's onto autos. Everyone's different. Everyone learns at different speed. So just focus on enjoying each step. Even when things don't go right, see what you can learn from it. Keep taking steps forward. It's good to check in and see, what other people are doing too. But remember, it's not a race, and everyone gets there at a slightly different pace. So let's look in a little bit more detail about the private pilot certificate, the first certificate most people are going to get. So during what we call the pre-solo stage, we're doing a lot of ground. We're learning about regulations, aerodynamics, weather, navigation, emergency procedures, and that could be with an instructor, in a college class, online, or own reading, or a combination of. And then the flight training here, we're looking at the basic maneuvers, hovering, takeoffs, landings, auto rotations, and some other basic flight maneuvers. We're also going to be studying and take the pre-solo knowledge test, which focuses on solo level knowledge, specifically about the aircraft you're flying and the airspace you're flying in. And that's not really a pass-fail. That's always corrected up to 100% with your instructor, so we go over the questions you got wrong. If you're a 141 school, which we'll talk about later, then there'll also be a formal Stage 1 check, which is a flight and a ground assessment with another instructor. Assuming everything goes good, and we get to the big day, a really big step, and that is when you get to fly solo. And then you'll start building your solo hours towards your requirements. Then we move into the second stage of private pilot, which is what we call post-solo. So you've got your solo started, and now we're going to sort of focus on some of the advanced maneuvers on-off airports, cross-country navigation, and getting ready for the check ride, getting those maneuvers down. You'll also be taking your knowledge test, which for the private pilot in the US, you would have to be doing pretty good. I mean, you have to get 70% pass rate, but with the new ACS Airman Certification Standards, the higher you get on your knowledge test, the less they have to dig when it comes to the actual oral assessment at the end when you do your check ride. Here's a quick video of some prepware software called Dauntless that helps you prepare for that written test, and I have a discount code for you in the description. Now, as you get ready for the check ride, you'll be taking a mock check ride, a pretend check ride with another instructor typically. If you're going through a 141 school, there'll be a formal end of course EOC check or Stage 2 check that's trying to put you in the position of what the check ride's really going to be like, and they typically... A good stage check, end of course check, is harder than the check ride, so it kind of really finds all your holes and gives you the confidence to go forward for your check ride. And then you go take the check ride itself, the big day. There's a lot of paperwork and checking your logbook and doing something called IACRA, which is making sure you have all the requirements, checking your endorsements. Make sure you have all that squared away, and your instructor will be a big part of making sure that's all good, so you don't have to have any stresses about the paperwork. Then you get into a ground, which is the examiner going through all the ground subjects, making sure you know your stuff, and all of that is outlined in the Airman Certification Standard, or ACS. I have a bunch of videos, which again I'll put in the description, about the ACS. That's the ACS for private pilot and for all the ratings is your kind of map of all the things that you should know. Assuming everything goes good, then you go and take the flight, and then you'll be assessed on certain maneuvers, and the criteria for the passing of each maneuver is again in the ACS. And fingers crossed it all goes well, and you walk away with a private pilot certificate. Now, even if it doesn't, there's a lot to be learned from a failure, and I put the link in the description of Kenny Keller's talk about what happened when he failed his check ride. As for how many hours this all takes, the minimum for Part 141 is 35 flight hours. For Part 61, it's 40 hours. Don't listen to anyone that quotes you those numbers. That's just not realistic at all. The average is around 65. I think I saw on the FAA website the other day that the US average is actually 75. And again, this takes roughly between 3 to 6 months. I have a video series that follows a student from day one all the way through to check ride, and I'll put a link to that series as well. Now, once you get your private pilot certificate, you could stop there. You can say, okay, I'm a helicopter pilot. If you can afford to buy your own helicopter, great. Good luck on getting insurance, though. A lot of them want quite high hours to even insure you without paying a ridiculous amount of money. I know of stories of people who buy their helicopter and then have to fly with an instructor till they get to a certain number of hours because the insurance just won't cover them for that low, or they self-insure. The other thing, though, is if you get your private pilot, you might think, well, I'll just go and rent a helicopter when I need to fly one. Unlike airplanes, it's pretty rare to find a school that will rent a helicopter, especially to a low-hour person. The helicopters are usually kept for the flight school, and the insurance and everything is all set up for flight training with an instructor, and obviously some solo work in private and commercial, but not really renting it out to what we call renters. The second course of training that most helicopter pilots are going to be working on is called their instrument training. It's called instrument because you're going to spend most of the time looking at the instruments. You're flying by reference to the instruments. You often wear a hood or a view limiting device that restricts your view outside, so you have to focus, instead of on the cues from your horizon, you're looking at the artificial horizon and the other instruments inside the helicopter. There's various different types of hoods and goggles, foggles. One of the newer things out there is an Icarus device, which is pretty neat, that we have a demo of that I'll be doing a review on. Or you go into a simulator, some sort of what we call a simulator, to recreate the idea that you're in the clouds. Light training helicopters are not certified to fly in the clouds, which is known as instrument meteorological conditions, but they can fly legally in the IFR system, or instrument flight rule system. The way that works, we could talk about in another future episode. But overall, this makes you a safer, better pilot. You're more precise with your flying. You get much more confidence with talking to air traffic control, and often required for jobs. And to be honest, this could save your life one day if you accidentally go into the clouds. There is a 14% survival rate of going inadvertently into the clouds, known as inadvertent IMC or unintentional IMC. So it's an important skill to have. You'll also be learning a bunch of new skills here, and understanding of things like how an attitude indicator works, and also a directional gyro or heading indicator, or maybe you have a HSI, horizontal situational indicator, turn coordinator. All these are new instruments to learn about as you go into your instrument training. You're also going to learn about new ways to navigate using VORs and ILS and localizer and GPS. There's a lot more new acronyms to learn. On top of that, there's LDA, SDF, WAS, ASR, PAR. You'll understand all of these as you go through your instrument training. There's also new maps and charts. You'll notice on the instrument charts, the topography and landmarks are gone, which makes sense. You can't see outside anyway, right? You got a whole bunch of new symbols to learn. And just like you did for your private, you're gonna be able to read these charts. You're gonna give what we call plate briefings, etc. You're gonna be able to safely fly, taking off from an airport, putting the hood on, using a departure procedure to keep you safe, not fly into any obstacles, get into what's called the en route system, and then maybe do an arrival, and then pick up an instrument approach procedure, or an IAP, and you'll fly that instrument approach precisely down to perhaps 200 feet above the runway, all without looking outside. It's pretty amazing, really. There'll be new radio phraseology, things like helicopter 123 Lima Echo, turn left heading 210, maintain 6,000 till established, cleared for the ILS 23. Now, that's a whole mouthful of stuff that if you've never heard that before, you would have trouble working out what to say back. It may involve learning a new aircraft too, or a simulator, or we call it, the one we have is an AATD, Advanced Aviation Training Device. So you're going to spend some time in the simulator to build some experience and build some of the requirements you need for simulated time. The great thing about the sim is it can kind of save you money too, because it's cheaper than a helicopter typically. We can also throw in a bunch of scenario-based training, lost comms and failures and emergency procedures in the clouds, which we can't usually safely do some of that stuff in the helicopter. Now we switch, the way we do it at our school is we switch into the R44 for the instrument rating. That builds you some time in the R44, which you need to be able to teach in the R44 anyway. You need at least 25 hours, and that's assuming that you have 25 hours in the R22 as well. So you're building some experience in another platform, which is neat. You get to get out the 22 into the R44. There's a lot more power. A lot more performance. You can take people in the back. Now, it's still going to require a knowledge test, the instrument knowledge test, and then we do a end of course stage check as well before the check ride. I'll give you a little tip here. If you're taking the instrument test, it's a good idea, if you did really good, to go straight back in and do a CFII knowledge test. They're very, very similar, and it's good for 2 years. If you wait till you've done your commercial and your CFI and then go back to do your CFII knowledge test, it takes a lot more time to ramp up to that knowledge level again. You can also do your instrument ground instructor too if you ever want to get those written tests out of the way. They're almost identical. As for the requirements, well, the Part 141 requirements are quite a bit lower than the Part 61 requirements. For Part 61, you need to get 50 hours across country, 40 hours of simulated instrument. Whereas in the Part 141, which is the way we do it, it is 35 hours minimum, which includes up to 14 hours can be done in the sim or the AATD, and then 21 hours in the helicopter. Reality, probably end up with about 25 hours in the helicopter, which again, you need 25 hours in the R44 to teach anyway. Typically, this is going to take about 3 to 6 months. Now, it is a hard rating. I think a lot of people find instrument, there's a lot of procedures, there's a lot of new things to learn, and you spend a lot of time under the hood, so you're not enjoying the surroundings. We don't get to do too many off airports, that kind of stuff. So it can be a bit of a slog, but it's worth it. Get it done, because the next rating is the really fun one. Typically, the third course of training that a helicopter student would do would be the commercial rating. So this is essentially for the pilot to get a commercial certificate and be able to earn money flying helicopters, although in the US that's pretty limited in what you can actually do with that limited amount of hours. But this is by far the most fun training for most students and instructors, actually. You already know how to fly. You've just got over the hump of instrument flying where you're under the hood and it's all about procedures. Now we're going to do some ground knowledge. We have to still do the ground. We're going to be expanding and deepening your knowledge. We're going to add some extra regulations, Part 119 exceptions. But because it's really review of stuff that you should know from private, some students start building their lesson plans at this point. So they're getting ready to be an instructor, to work on being an instructor on the next rating. So as they go back and review this knowledge, they'll start to build their own lesson plans to kind of get ahead of the game for the ground that's coming up in the CFI or Certified Flight Instructor rating. But it's the flying that's the really fun bit. So the commercial level flying, we're taking the maneuvers you did at the private level and we're kind of increasing the precision and the confidence of the pilots in what they do in all the maneuvers, but also we're doing a lot more off airports, more challenging off airports, more pinnacles and ridges and helipads or cliff approaches. There's also a lot of cross-country flying, so we often take the aircraft for double blocks or longer and go out and explore, refuel, go do some off airports. We also get into more advanced autos, the Vershad recovery from vortex ring state. All those things start to make more sense now at the commercial level where the students got enough skill in the aircraft that they can really start to deepen their knowledge of these maneuvers and really build their confidence. So there's a lot of fun happening in this rating. We're also covering commercial scenarios. One of the things I used to do with my commercial students is we would talk about one of the Part 119 exceptions. I would get them to treat me as a customer, and I would ask them, I want to do this job. Maybe it was a survey thing or a photography thing or even a skydiving project. I'd say, okay, I want you to research all the regulations, all the performance, all the weight and balance, etc. Even give me a quote of a cost. And on Monday, we're going to go fly this. And then when we get there on Monday, I would get them to treat me as a customer. And we'd run kind of the scenario where I might be a pushy customer asking them to do things that they can't do legally or safely. And we would, up to a point, obviously I'm not going to jump out of the helicopter, but we would try to simulate some of these commercial scenarios. I've got videos of all those scenarios. At some point I'll put those up as a commercial series of videos. But And the student I was working with at the time, the first couple of flights, he would start getting kind of snarky with me, and he wasn't really playing in the role playing. So I'd say to him, right, I'm gonna give you a review, and I set up a little Yelp review of his so-called business. I created a pretend helicopter business for him, and then I wrote in the review, I did a flight with this guy, and he seems to know his stuff, but he was kind of rude to me, and so we really got into the whole scenario-based stuff. It was fun. Now, you're still going to have to do, obviously, a knowledge test. We do an end-of-course check or a mock stage check or a mock check ride, and then obviously the check ride itself. Typically, we do this under Part 61 because under the Part 61 rules, it just makes more sense. We're trying to get the least amount of time for the students to get it done as quickly as possible. And that usually, for Part 61, that would be 150 hours in total, 100 PIC, 50 in helicopter, etc. We're looking again around 3 to 6 months, depending on weather availability, etc. But yeah, this is the fun one. This is the last big hurrah before they have to get really serious again, and the next rating where you have to start working on becoming an instructor, fundamentals of instruction, FOIs, building lesson plans and stuff. So this is the fun before heads down, time to work again. Really get your nose to the grindstone. The fourth course of training for students in the US is CFI, or Certified Flight Instructor. To be honest, not a lot of students enjoy this course. There's a lot of ground and not much flying. We're going to cover things like the FOIs, which is the fundamentals of instruction. The fundamentals of instruction are principles of learning, teaching methods, communication, student evaluation, etc. It's like a mini teaching course. There's a handbook, the FAA Aviation Instructors Handbook. There's a lot to learn under FOIs. I would highly recommend that when you're learning this, or if you're teaching it, make sure that the FOIs are not just about memorization and cheat sheets and memory aids, but think about each concept as a little scenario. Think about how give an example of how a student might exhibit this particular problem, or how you might apply this particular method. That's the best way to deeply understand FOIs and do much better on the check ride, because the check rides will typically be scenario-based. The other thing you're going to be working on, if you haven't already, is getting your lesson plans. So you're supposed to have lesson plans for the ground subjects and the flight lessons. And don't forget the flight lessons. For my CFI check ride, I had completely forgotten the flight lessons. And I got through the ground, and at the very end, the examiner said, okay, now teach me your lesson on rapid decelerations or whatever it was, and I just blanked, and I luckily managed to pull something together quite quickly. But yes, you need to have lesson plans for ground subjects and the flight lessons. Which ground subjects? Well, the reference here is going to be the new ACS, Airman Certification Standard for the CFI. You want to be looking at that. There's a lot of stuff in there that's changed from the practical test standards before. So make sure you deep dive into the CFI ACS and the private ACS too, because that's kind of helping you understand what level you would be teaching this stuff to. There's also a lot of CFI and student-specific regulations, so what you need to do to sign off for a solo or sign someone off for a check ride. And then the endorsements is another big part of it too. There's an advisory circular all about the endorsements, and you need to make sure you understand those. You can't remember it all. You never can remember it all. There's a lot of needing to know where your references are, so you need to pull out references when you can't remember the full details. And there's 2 knowledge tests. And you've got to do the FOI knowledge test as well as the instructor knowledge test. I highly recommend you get those out of the way as soon as possible. You could even do those at the end of your commercial. The commercial written test, knowledge test, is actually not too far off of the instructor written test, so you might want to pair those two together. But the FOIs, you'd have to really study up on the FOIs before you go take the FOI test. Statistically, in the past, the FOI knowledge test had one of the lowest scores. People don't do so well on that. Again, I highly recommend software like Dauntless, to help prep you for those knowledge tests. And I'll put the link to a discount for you in the description for that software. The flight training, unfortunately, there isn't a lot of it. At this point, you're getting close to finishing up. You'll be moving to the left seat because you're doing all the other training in the right seat. And now you're in the left seat, the instructor seat. And so there's a little bit of getting used to that, the sight picture, the position of the hand with the door interfering with the collective. And you're going to be teaching all the maneuvers to ACS standards whilst flying and talking at the same time, which is, again, if something you haven't really got into much in your commercial, which I recommend. As you get towards the end of the commercial, there's a lot of hours there. You can transition into the left seat, or even if you stay in the right seat, just start getting into the method of talking whilst instructing and using the right amount of verbalization while still keeping an ear on the radios and maintaining situational awareness. It's quite a balancing act. You're also going to be working on identifying and fixing common student errors. We have a simulator, so we also get our CFI students to spend a little bit of time in the simulator working on everything we've said so far, but also we can do some dangerous student errors, things that we can't do in the helicopter, like a student rolling the throttle on instead of rolling it off for an auto entry, which would cause immediate overspeed, or dangerously low RPM, all those kind of things. They do a little bit of that, and when we hire on our instructors, we really do a deep dive on dangerous student errors in the sim. We give them a lot of internal training on top of that, but it's good to see as you're getting into the mindset of being an instructor through this rating. The highlight of this rating for most people is that you get to do full down or touchdown auto rotations. So most of the autos you do up to this point are going to be what's called power recovery. We don't bring the aircraft down to the ground. We bring the engine back into the auto rotation in the flare, and then we come to a stabilized hover. Full down auto rotations, statistically, there is a higher chance of damaging the aircraft. In the past, you would have to do a full down auto rotation with the examiner on the check ride. The FAA and the examiners didn't like that very much because it increases the risk there. So now they get the instructors teaching CFI to teach full down auto rotations with the CFI students. And when they're at a proficient level, they get a full down auto rotation endorsement. And then they don't have to do a full down auto rotation on the check ride, unless they fail their 180 or their straight in regular auto rotation, and then they have to go back out with the examiner, and they'll have to do a full down at that point, which examiners really don't want to have to do because they're not very proficient in doing auto rotations to a full down in an R22. A lot of them aren't doing that very often, and there's quite a high risk there. But we do this under Part 61. There's no hour minimums. Once you've already got your commercial, you just really need to be proficient. But you do need 200 hours to teach in the R22 and R44 if that's the airframe that you're working in. Typically takes, again, about 3 to 6 months to get this. And some people will get their CFI and CFII done in that 3 to 6 months. But you get your CFI done, you take your 2 writtens, you take a very long oral check ride, so you'll be, some of them 6 hours or more, but they're usually quite, one of the longest oral parts of a check ride is for your CFI rating. Going to go over the FOIs and lots of scenarios of student type stuff, as well as testing your knowledge in a variety of areas. And then you go and fly, and assuming everything goes good and you get that done, congratulations, you are now able to teach to private and commercial students. Like I said, you need 200 hours to do that in flight in a Robinson, and most places would like you to get your CFII, which is the next rating, before you work for them, which we're going to talk about in a second. This is also a good time to go to the new Robinson Instructor Pilot Standardization course, which is aimed at instructors working in Robinson aircraft, which is different than the old pilot safety course, which was really just new owners and new pilots to the Robinson product. We're hoping to host that Instructor Pilot Standardization course at our school in February, so if that ends up happening, I'll give you details about how that went. For many, the 5th and final level of training in the US for a helicopter student is the CFII, or the Certified Flight Instructor with Instrument Rating, the final step. So just like the CFI, we do CFII under Part 61. There's no hour minimums once you have your CFI certificate and your instrument rating. Often a short course. I managed to do it in 2 weeks. I'm not saying that's normal, but it's often just kind of getting your head back into the game. And that's the hardest piece, is you probably haven't flown instruments or really thought about instrument knowledge for many, many months. You've been doing commercial, and then you got into CFI with fundamentals of instruction and lesson plans for your CFI. So one of the things that we do at our schools, we recommend, allow and encourage students who are working on commercial and CFI to periodically be riding backseat in the R44s that are out doing instrument training and CFII training, sitting in on instrument grounds, keeping their head in the instrument game, because there's a lot that just kind of fades. CFII is still under the PTS or Practical Test Standards. It's one of the ones that hasn't been updated to the ACS. But have a look at that. It has been updated, even though it's still PTS. And also have a look at the new instrument ACS that will give you good understanding of what subjects you need to have an instructional level on. It's going to be, instrument regulations, the instrumentation, how it works, how to use it, how to read it, navigation, weather related to instrument flying, cross-country planning, obviously how to read and use the charts and the plates that are used in instruments. We put our CFII students back into the R44, so they're going to now be sat in the left seat and getting back into the flying instrument under the hood whilst teaching at the same time. Not just talking about what they're doing, but actually teaching. And that's a challenge. They haven't done that for a while. So if you're flying Robinson products, you not only need to have 200 hours to be able to teach in those airframes, but also you need an SFAR 73 instructor sign-off in both the R22 and R44 to teach in those. So you're also probably going to take the check ride, and at the end of the check ride, you've now got your CFII done, and you're now going to do a short piece for the SFAR 73 R44 instructor sign-off. So you're going to do the GIML stuff, so that's the governor off, inputs to maneuver in an order to make your spot, changing airspeed, turns, etc., RPM. You're also in the R44 having to do both max glide and minimum rate, and of course low RPM recognition recovery. Assuming you do all that satisfactory, you'll also get an SFAR 73 instructor sign-off for the R44. The whole thing to get to this point, like I said, could be somewhere between 1 to 2 years. But congratulations, you're now a CFII looking for that first instructor job, and that's a whole new episode talking about that first job. Not that you need ATP to get that first job, but just for completeness, we'll just quickly talk about what the ATP is. It's Airline Transport Pilot Certificate. It's the highest level of certification that you can get for a helicopter pilot. You need a bunch of hours to even get it. You need 1,200 hours. You need to be 23 years of age for the helicopter version, 500 hours across country, 100 hours of night, 75 hours of simulator or actual instrument, 50 in flight, and be of good moral character. I really wouldn't worry about it right now. You may never need it. Some companies pay for the check ride at least, and offer bonuses to your monthly paycheck if you have it. Some have contract requirements. So I worked for a company in the Gulf of Mexico that certain contracts required an ATP, and the company would pay you to get that ATP for the check ride. You still have to make sure you've got all the hours and do your own study at home, etc. And we're not paying for getting current in an aircraft, but they would pay for the actual check ride itself. I also worked for an EMS company, an air medical company that did the same sort of thing, and your monthly paycheck was higher if you had the ATP certificate. But it didn't stop me get either job. I would say, though, do not leave the flight school as an instructor without 100 hours of night. It is very hard to get that nighttime typically outside of the flight school. And I've said this to many instructors over the years, and far too many have had to come back and pay to get nighttime helicopter hours, either because they're trying to get ATP minimums, or a lot of air medical or EMS companies require at least 100 hours of night. So you can get it relatively easy in the flight school. There's a lot of instrument training that can be done at night, and you should be doing it at night to get the full experience of not getting the peripheral cues of flying during the daytime. It's harder, but it can really show you what real instrument flying would look like. And you're building night hours for you and your student, or you and your instructor, depending on which way you're doing it. So don't leave the flight school without 100 hours of night. And visit the ATP if you need it down the line. Another question here quite a bit is, do I need to get my airplane certificate before I get my helicopters? No, the answer is you do not need to get an airplane pilot certificate first. The helicopter track is completely separate. You just start with private, as we already talked about, in helicopter and work your way through. But sometimes you may come to a situation where it might make sense to go airplane first. And that is if you were wanting to be dual rated, then you would be more efficient to get your airplane rating first and then get the helicopter add-on, because it takes less hours and helicopters are more expensive. But you got to remember, if you want to be an instructor on the helicopter side in the R22 and R44, you still need 200 hours helicopter anyway. Another question we hear a lot is, I already have my airplane certificate. How can I get a helicopter add-on rating? Add-on ratings happen all the time at our flight school. When you're going from an airplane to helicopter, it's relatively straightforward. There's no knowledge tests. You can do a private add-on, Part 61, with 20 hours of dual and 10 hours of solo. If you do it Part 141, and we offer that opportunity through our school, it's 15 hours of ground, 20 hours of dual and no solo. But to be honest, most people are doing add-ons at private level around 40 hours. We also have a Part 141 commercial add-on course. So if you want to go from airplane to helicopter and get your commercial add-on, that's 20 hours of ground and 30 hours of flight. But to be honest, you may need more hours than that. You got to think about, you're going to be doing a commercial helicopter check ride. A commercial helicopter pilot who's gone straight through private instrument and nothing to do with airplanes, they're going to be doing that at around 150 hours. And I'm not saying you need 150 hours, but it is not likely that you will be able to do 30 hours in a helicopter and be able to perform at commercial level standards. But that is the minimum. And again, if you want to teach in the R22 or the R44, you need 200 hours in helicopter anyway. I got my private helicopter first, and then I got an airplane private add-on just so I could go and rent an airplane and fly around Central Oregon. In the end, further down, I didn't realize this was going to happen. I ended up doing a short stint flying for the airlines, which I like to call the dark times. But at the time, they paid for all of my ratings. So I got all the way up to airplane, multi-engine, ATP. The airlines paid for all that. And so the reason I'm telling you that is it's, from my experience, it was pretty easy doing an add-on rating going that way. I think it's relatively easy coming the other way from airplane to helicopter. It's just the control inputs, the sensitivity. That's a lot harder going that way. But in terms of knowing all the airspace stuff, there's a few changes here and there in regulations. But otherwise, it's pretty straightforward. So we've talked a little bit about Part 61 and 141. We referred to that in some of the earlier content. There's a lot of videos out there comparing Part 61 and 141, so I'm going to keep this short and simple. First of all, let's cover the things that are the same. So whether it's a Part 141 or a Part 61 school, you still come out with the same certificate. Your certificate looks the same as anyone else's, no matter which school they went to. You're also going to take the same knowledge tests, and for the most part, you're going to take the same check ride. There are a few schools that have something called examining authority for some of their courses. For that situation, you do a stage check with an internal school instructor that counts for your check ride. That can affect reducing waiting times for examiners and etc. But those things can't be applied to reduced hour courses, so they don't usually do that for all of their courses, and they're pretty rare. Now let's have a look at some of the differences. The 141 school is FAA certified, so they have approved training course outlines. They're issued an air agency certificate and Part 141 letter of authorization. They have to maintain a pass rate to keep that 141 certificate, so there's a lot more FAA oversight. Both 61 and 141 ensure compliance with all the regs and everything and the standards, but the standards are a little bit stricter for Part 141 schools. Like I said, they must have an FAA approved syllabus, meet a higher level of scrutiny from the FAA. The CFIIs, the instructors, and the official stage instructors are both 141 certified with certain training standards, recurrent training, etc. Can a school do both Part 61 and 141? If it is a Part 141 school, they can do both Part 61 and 141 courses. If it's a Part 61 school, they can only do Part 61. I help run a 141 school, and through your helicopter training through our school, some courses you do 141 and some Part 61, and that's based usually on what is the lowest amount of hours for the student, so we can pick and choose to make it as efficient as possible. Structured versus flexible. Because the 141 schools training course outlines, etc., are approved by the FAA, we have to follow those courses. So there is certain lessons that have to be followed, certain hours of ground, etc. Under Part 61, if you do a Part 61 course, there are still minimums and areas that you have to cover, but it can be a lot more flexible. So that can maybe work sometimes for someone who only has a few weeks to fly and they want to dip in and out, or maybe they want to work on more of an intense course. The 141 setup is more consistent in the topics that are covered, the pass rates, etc. required for stage checks. There's, like I said, minimum ground training. There's a very clear pathway, and you kind of know what you're going to get regardless of which instructor you have, whereas Part 61 can be a little bit more flexible and a little bit more inconsistent. Lower minimums. Yeah, sometimes for both. Typically, the 141 courses we use a private and instrument because we can leverage the lower minimums that the 141 courses allow to get someone through a little bit lower number of hours than a Part 61. So we have the ability as a 141 school to do that, and then when, say, commercial, it makes more sense perhaps to use Part 61, we can do that as well. Which one's faster? Well, Part 141, again, if you know you're getting less hours through some of these courses, it can be faster, but then also a Part 61 school might have more flexibility to push you through, not have to cover all of the ground that we have to cover in private, for example. So if you're doing a home study course or something like the online ground school, and you just want to come in and just bash through the flight training, that might be easy to do at Part 61 school. But I also say a Part 141 school can also switch and do private as Part 61. So if we had someone come to us and say, hey, I've done all of my ground, I don't want to do a 141 course for private, I just want to turn up and do the flying, we can do that too. Cheaper? Well, again, it really does depend. I'd say generally Part 61 schools might be a little bit cheaper. In the long run, you might think a 141 school could be cheaper because you're getting reduced minimums. I would also say that cheaper really does not mean better. So keep that in mind. Price is obviously important, but look at the bigger picture. There's so many other factors. This is a big one though. My understanding is that Part 141 schools are much, much, much more likely to be able to access veteran funding for someone who wants to come in and use their funding to go through the course. My understanding is that is either less likely or not possible through Part 61, or it's quite restricted through Part 61 schools. And we'll talk a little bit about funding in the next couple of slides. Which one's better? Well, again, it really does depend. There are some really great Part 61 schools and some really great Part 141 schools, and there are some crappy versions of both. So there's so many other factors: location, airframe, reputation, the fleet, the cost, the individual instructor. So do not get tied into, I have to go to a Part 141 or Part 61, unless it's something like restricting your ability to access funding. Now here's another question that gets asked a lot, choosing the right helicopter for training. So first of all, I'd say it doesn't matter so much really as the instructor and the other variables affecting your progress, like the availability, weather, how close it is to where you live, etc. But it can affect potentially your opportunities for your first job. We'll talk about that in a minute. But at the end of the day, they are great pilots flying all sorts of missions in all sorts of airframes, and they learn in all sorts of helicopter models. So don't be boxed into thinking you have to fly a certain model. But let's go through some options. Robinson R22, there's a lot of them around. They're quite fast, they're twitchy, they are quite hard to, as far as some of these other models, they are relatively hard to learn to fly in. They have a slim cockpit, so it's quite cozy, side by side. Seat weight limit is 240 pounds. Ideally, you want to be quite a bit under that, especially if you're thinking about trying to become an instructor. There are lots of them around, and so it is easier to find work. If you came through a Robinson school and you didn't get hired on there for some reason, there are a lot of other options across the country flying Robinsons. Now there is the whole SFAR 73 thing with low G and low RPM considerations. The SFAR 73 is a specific rule. There's a whole history of that, and I have some videos that talk about what that training means. But that shouldn't put you off. Any helicopter can be dangerous if it's not flown properly, so don't be put off by some of the negativity you hear about Robinsons. I almost guarantee the people that are saying that have not got very much, if any, time in the R22. Me and Kenny Keller talked about that a fair bit. It's a good airframe. I mean, it's reliable, and like I say, there's a lot of them around. The R22s run, depends on where you are in the country, somewhere around $300 to $350 an hour. Now, if you're a bigger person and the R22 is not a fit for you, There is the R44 that has a 300-pound seat limit. It is obviously a lot more expensive to run. You're talking about $650 to $700 if you're renting. One quick thing to add is there's also the R44 Cadet, which is going to be cheaper, and the Raven 1 is cheaper than the Raven 2. Another thing is that the R44, it is easier generally than the R22 to learn to fly, despite the cost. It's something to consider. Our flight school, we do a little bit of both. We do most of our training in the R22, but we also get you in the R44. That's great because it gets you the hours you need to be able to teach in both the R22 and the R44. And as you progress as an instructor, it opens the door for some of the R44 jobs like Pollux up in Alaska with having R44 time. The Cabri, this is a great modern aircraft. It's been designed specifically for training. It's safe. It's easier to learn. It is the European style in that the blades turn in the different direction to the R22 and R44. So you have a different power pedal and there's some aerodynamics that are kind of opposite. It's really like a mini EC-130 or H-130. Cool helicopter. No seat weight limit as far as I understand. It's more of a center of gravity limit. There aren't so many of them around, but the numbers are increasing. And they are typically running about $450 to $500 an hour. The Enstrom, there's a few of those around, piston Enstroms, depends on the model, but I think they're around a 300-pound seat weight, typically running about $350 to $400 an hour. Now, you do have ground resonance with these fully articulated helicopters to consider, so that's another thing to be thinking about. No helicopter's perfect, they've all got things you have to be concerned about. I don't think that would, again, stop you from choosing it to train in, but just to understand. Not so many of them around. So again, if you come out of training and you can't work for your flight school, you will have to travel a fair bit to maybe find another Enstrom operator. Schweitzer. Schweitzers have been around a long time, and they're a good training helicopter in that they're pretty mellow for autos. They do suffer from ground resonance as well. They're quite slow, so if you want to get anywhere, they've got quite a wide cockpit. They have a seat weight of around 300 pounds per seat, I believe. $300 to $350 an hour. And again, one of the main problems is there's just not so many of them around. Maybe your own helicopter. Maybe you want to buy your own helicopter. We know clients who have done that. They've bought a Bell 505, for example, and they do maybe their initial training in the R22, and then they work up to get some time and experience in their own helicopter. The trouble with that is typically it's an insurance issue, so they may have to fly with an instructor to build hours after the initial certifications are done, but that's another option too if you can afford it. I think one of the big questions with the airframes is how is it equipped? Can you do your instrument training in those aircraft? How does it affect your first job opportunities? For example, you could be the best student and you come in with 200 hours, a really nice person, but if you haven't got 50 hours in the R22, you can't be hired to work as an R22 instructor. And to be honest, most people would want to see a lot more than 50 hours in the R22 to be an instructor in the R22. That's just the legal minimum. But we have current instructors that work for us that started in Schweitzers and started in Cabri, and they switched and came to us early, about 60 hours in. They did the rest of the training in the R22 and the R44, and their varied experience adds to their skills and knowledge. So remember, you can move school. You don't have to stay for whatever reason. These guys moved to come work with us and finish up their ratings, and they came work as an instructor for us further down the line. There's obviously a bit of a learning curve to any change, though, whether it's changing school, airspace, or airframe, but that's something to consider as well. As a bit of an afterthought, I went to the FAA registry for aircraft, downloaded the database, and sorted it by airframe type, and got the numbers. And these are all aircraft that have been registered for private owners, commercial operations, as well as, obviously, flight schools. But it'll give you a rough idea of the breakdown of airframes. There were over 1,800 R44s. Now, that's a lot. There's quite a few used for commercial operations as well as private ownership, not just the flight schools. It is the most common light helicopter in the US. There were about 800 R22s of all different models. There was 420-ish Schweitzer Hughes piston models, the 269 and 300 series. Around 260 Enstrom piston models, the 280s and the F28s. and 60 Cabri G2s. So how much is this all going to cost? So when we talk about the average total costs, remember first of all, this is not just aircraft rental. We're talking about including flight instruction, ground instruction, sim time if simulators are used, check ride fees, getting your medical, books, supplies, and there are many variables. But one thing I would say is do not trust a school who's only giving you the FAA minimum quotes. That is completely unrealistic. We've already sort of talked about that. Go look somewhere else, I would say, if that's what they're using to give you an idea of what you're supposed to be paying. The other thing is these numbers do not include life expenses, the cost of living, right? So certain areas of the country, it's going to be a lot more expensive for rent, that kind of thing. So keep that in mind too. And overall, the cheapest does not mean the best quality of training, does not mean the best chance for your career, the best chance for you to get through your training. So private pilot, typically you're looking somewhere between 20 to 30,000. Instrument, about 25 to 30,000. Commercial, 20 to 30,000. And that's assuming that you do it in that order, private instrument, commercial. CFI, 7 to 12,000. CFII, 8 to 13,000. So overall, you're looking at somewhere between 80 to 120,000. Again, a lot of variability, a lot of different things go into that number. So some tips about how to try to keep it closer to 80 than 120. Having the ability to dedicate your training as to be the thing that you do and not have to break it up with, okay, I can only do training for 2 weeks and then I have to work for 2 weeks. I know that's not possible for everyone, but if you can, try to, if you have to break training up to fund it, I would at least try to get enough money together to complete an entire rating. And maybe you do a lot of ground study beforehand and then you just take 2 weeks off work and you slam the flying, or maybe longer, depends on what training we're doing at that point. Trying to pick things back up again midstream through with a break, overall that's going to cost you more money. So if you can, try to at least have enough funding and enough time to get one rating done at a time, if not all of it. The other thing I keep saying, study, study, study. The flying is relatively easy once you get the hang of hovering, etc. It's the studying is the bit that can really drag these things on. I had a student, and one of the things he used to do, and I've had a few other people do this as well, is not only was he taking notes during ground, but after a flight event, he would take notes that I had given him of things he needed to work on, and then he would just go sit alone for 5-10 minutes and do a little log in a notebook of all the little things he learned himself or things he wanted to work on during that flight. And then again, he would review that before he goes flying the next time. Little things like that. And we will do a future episode, I'm sure, about how to be a good student, things you can do. Another thing is be ready to adapt. Turn up to in a flight or a sim or a ground with everything to do every other type of event. Sometimes the sim's down. Sometimes the helicopter's cancelled due to weather and maintenance, etc. Have your books, have your study material, have your headset, etc., so that you can adapt and still make it an event that you can learn from. Maybe you go to turn up for a flight, your aircraft's down, you're fine with studying, you've done enough studying for the day, so maybe there's an opportunity to ride backseat in an R44 that's going out with another instructor. See if anyone wants to study. Sit in the helicopter sitting in a helicopter that's on the ground, just practicing EPs for 20 minutes. Have lunch at the airport cafe with headphones listening to live ATC while you're watching these aircraft move around and reviewing your study notes, etc. Just keep looking for those opportunities to learn and to keep moving forward. Also, I would say keep aside some extra cash for unexpected delays. Things like, I think I'm going to take my check ride next week, then weather comes in, or the examiner's ill, and now you need to put another flight in just to stay current. We've seen those that did not fly for the 2 weeks or more before the check ride had a much, much higher chance of failure on the check ride. So they think they're saving money by not flying in that 2 weeks, and then they fail the check ride. They have to do a training flight with their instructor and another flight with the examiner. So it doesn't work up saving the money at all. And I'm sure there's people out there who are going to have quite a different experience in terms of the numbers. So again, these are just averages that we've seen from the research I've done over the last few years. I'm not telling you there are no other options, but this is what we've seen as average. It really does cost a lot of money to become a helicopter pilot. So what are some of the options to fund that? One option is federal student loans or personal loans. If you're doing this training in connection with a college, then you would have access to student loans. Maybe it's part-time work. Maybe you're working whilst learning to fly. The way I did it is I just worked for a couple of years, saving, and tried to save up enough to come and do it with minimum amount of loans. A big part of our flight school is students that are using VA funding. Now, a few years back, there was a few schools that were abusing this, and some students were somehow costing the VA $500,000 or more. They were doing training in turbine aircraft like A-Stars all the way through their training, and it was costing the taxpayer obviously a lot more than it should. So there was some big changes, and through that, one of the changes was for a lot of flight schools, the student, if they were VA funded, would have to have got their private pilot first, which is going to cost you, anywhere between $15,000 to $20,000, unless the flight school is associated with getting a degree. And those schools that are associated with getting a degree, like the school I work at, they allow full funding where the student can come in with zero experience and be funded all the way through to getting their CFII. Also, full-time college courses have additional housing and book stipends. There's another way, which is to come directly to a school with VA funding, and I think that's limited to about $16,000, $17,000 a year. I can't remember. Where there's no connection with a flight school, it's just coming in to use some of the VA funding, and we get some people doing that as well. If you're looking at doing this, ask the VA about this. They have a comparison tool where you can put in areas of the country that you're interested in and find out what schools and colleges have been pre-approved, and obviously speak to the flight school that you're interested in. Scholarships, that's another big one. There are a lot of aviation scholarships out there. The FAA, AOPA, and EAA all have lists of aviation scholarships. There's the Whirly Girls Aviation Scholarships. I'll put some links to those in the description. Ask the flight school. Some flight schools and colleges issue scholarships as well. We do something like that, and also they do bulk discounts. Things like if you put down $5,000 on the account, you get 5% bonus, that kind of stuff. I know it's not a lot, but it all helps. Also ask the flight school about all of this stuff. Do they have any information on funding options? Do they have any connections for loans, etc.? So here's a really big question for a lot of people trying to get into learning to fly, is how to choose a flight school. So there's many factors, and we'll go through some of the things to be considered, some of the questions to ask. Location. That's a key thing. Are you willing to relocate for flight training, or do you need to find something nearby? How far is the drive? Is it reasonable for you to be able to make that drive consistently through the year, or however long you're going to be doing your training? If you are moving, are you moving to somewhere where the school has varied and challenging terrain and airspace? If you're flying for a little quiet area in the middle of nowhere, how are you going to get the experience of towered operations or busier airspace? Or maybe it's the other way around. You're in a very busy airspace and you've never moved to a non-towered airport. It'd be nice if you could get a bit of both. Another consideration is something called high DA, or high density altitude, versus sea level. High density altitude is operations at higher altitudes and in warmer conditions where the air is thinner and the aircraft struggles to perform. And that sounds bad, but it's actually good experience. That's something that employers further down the line are looking for. So, a person at sea level is going to have an easier way of getting things done, but not necessarily the better training. Someone who's up in the mountains and getting some high density altitude is kind of getting a better experience and becoming a better pilot through those experiences. Weather, another one. Are you going to move somewhere that is on the rainy side of the mountains? Is it going to be flying for only 6 to 9 months of the year reliably, and then you're going to spend a lot of time just looking out the window waiting for the right weather? So those are things to think about as well. Airframe, what's the aircraft type? We've already sort of talked a little bit about that. Same with the cost. We've covered that a little bit. That's a big, important piece, but it should definitely not be the most important piece. How big's the flight school? Do you want to work with a small mom and pop type flight school, or would you want to work for a bigger flight school? If you get to a really big flight school, does it feel just like a pilot mill? So you would need to work out how that affects your choice. Are you just another number, or do they know who you are? Are you going to be at a school that's busy enough to make sure that when you're an instructor, you have enough students, or that you may not even get hired on as an instructor because there's just not enough turnover, not enough revenue coming in with the students that they have. So all those are things to consider as well. What's their maintenance like? Who does their maintenance? Are they doing maintenance in-house? What's the level of the maintenance experience that they have? Some of the bigger schools, like the one I work for, we rebuild Robinson products. We've got a lot of experience. We've got a huge maintenance facility, which you can go in and see what's going on. You can see the systems of the aircraft, ask questions of the maintenance personnel. But that's a really important point is, what's the maintenance like for the school? Do they have a college connection? Do you want to get an aviation degree? Do you need to get an aviation degree to release funding? So that's another consideration. What's their safety record like? Look up the NTSB aviation database for the company and see what their accident history is like. Now, training's high risk. An accident happening does not automatically mean a terrible school. Many accidents happening, that might be something you want to be asking them about. Do they have an SMS or safety management system? This is a proactive way to deal with safety and risk and try to manage those things and learn from those things. Kind of connected to that is what's their internal training like? How much training do their instructors get to keep them safe and be as good as they can be? What is the leadership experience like? Are the people running the school, have they been out in the industry? Do they have the connections that you might want to leverage to get that next job after being an instructor? What's the culture like? So you really need to be there to see that one. And that ties into the whole going there for a discovery flight or a demo flight. But have a look around. Do the instructors and the students and the staff, do they all look happy? Do they look stressed? Do they look like the kind of people and the kind of place that you want to be a part of? Reputation. The helicopter industry is a very small industry. So speak to a couple of pilots who've been out in the industry for a while. Ask them about the school you're talking about. See if it's a good school and it's got a good reputation. You'll know that. This is really one of the most important pieces before you decide to go and pick your flight school that you're going to go with, is go visit the school and do what's called a discovery or a demo flight. That's where you go out there, you meet the staff, you meet the instructors, you get a tour of the facility, you get all your questions answered, all these questions that we sort of talked about safety record and all that kind of stuff. And then you go and do a short flight. That may not be the instructor that you end up flying with if you choose the school, but you should get a pretty good idea of what does this look like? Do the aircraft look like they're in good condition? Does it feel like a good fit for you? Do they have time to answer your questions? Does it feel safe? Does it feel a place that you would want to be? And that's another part of it. As you're relocating, check out the town before or after you go fly. Is it somewhere you want to live? These are all really important things to be considering and asking before you commit to training. But even if you do commit to training, remember it's not locked in. You can move schools if it doesn't work out for you. But that's a discussion for another episode. So what are the next steps? Number one, like I said, is once you've kind of got a rough idea of the ones you're interested is some of the schools you're interested in, is go and visit those schools and try and get a discovery flight. I ended up doing, I think, 4 or 5 discovery flights in the US before I settled on the school I ended up at. And I'm not saying you have to do that many, but you really should at least do a couple. I have a webpage that goes into more detail about discovery or demo flights. And if you're looking for a flight school in the Pacific Northwest, it also includes a link to book a discovery flight at the school where I work at. You can check it out at helicoptertrainingvideos.com/demo. The link will also be in the episode notes. Some of the things about the getting a discovery flight is you don't have to have your medical. You don't need a student pilot certificate. There's no real prerequisites. You just need to come in comfortable clothes, closed-toe shoes, no flip-flops, and be ready to see what you think of it. If you decide this is definitely what you want to do, and most people do when they go take that flight, the next step is get your medical. Because without a medical, like we said, that you're not going to be able to get very far. And then, of course, secure funding, making sure that you are either getting loans or funding it yourself, or if you're using your VA benefits, making sure that that's all set up. And then finally, pick your school, set up a start date, and in the meantime, start studying. It's never too early to start studying, and we'll talk about what you can do on your own in a second. Another great question is, what can I do to study on my own before I get to flight school? Well, first of all, I'd say, make sure you hold off on any big purchases until you've done that discovery flight. You know it's what you want to do. You've secured a medical and the finances. And what I'm going to give you here is just some free or relatively cheap purchases to kind of get ahead on the ground school side of things. Already talked about the Helicopter Flying Handbook. That's a great book to start with. It covers helicopter operations, maneuvers, aerodynamics, systems, performance, hazards and emergencies. Great technique would be to, as you read through this, have a little study notebook, taking down notes, and also questions. So have a bunch of questions of things that don't make sense yet. So when you get to your instructor, you say, hey, I've read these chapters. You mind if we go through some of these questions? What does it mean when it says blah, blah, blah on page 26, etc.? So that's one free book you can get from the FAA, a PDF. Another one is the Pilot Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, known as the PHAK. That's more general pilot knowledge, airport operations, airspace, etc. There's other FAA books that are out there that are free as well, and I'll put all of these in the show notes. Aviation Weather Book's another good one. I have a full list of recommended books broken down by rating, and in there are links if you want to buy the paper version as well as any free PDFs. And so you can see there you've got broken down by private, instrument, commercial, etc. So if you want to find that, that's at helicoptertrainingvideos.com/books. Another thing is to be checking out all the training videos are out there. Helicopter Training Videos on YouTube has a lot of videos specifically aimed at new students. They're covering things like systems, flight maneuvers. There's a great series where you can watch a student from day one all the way through to check ride. You can hear all the in-cockpit radio calls, all the instruction being given, all the questions the student's asking. So you can almost start your flight training before you get to the flight school by sitting in, listening to those, and trying to put yourself in that position. What questions would you have? What makes sense? What doesn't? And little tips to pick up as you go through that. I also have an SFAR 73 ground training video. So if you're going to a Robinson school, flying 22s or 44s, that would be great to watch that video and take some notes on that. And I also have an SFAR 73 quiz to test your knowledge on those subjects, which also has FAA Wings credit if you want to get that. And of course, there's some other great videos out there too on YouTube to help you with the training. Another thing you can do is listen to podcasts like this while you're driving to and from work, etc. So the Helicopter Training Podcast, obviously, but also things like Aviation News Talk, which I already mentioned. It's more sort of a generic aviation news and safety, but the host, Max, has recently got into flying helicopters, so there's more helicopter content as well. Another great one I listen to is Opposing Bases, which is about air traffic control and pilot interactions. It's kind of explaining the whys we do things the way we do, what the controllers are seeing, why they're asking you to do certain things. It's actually humorous. It's actually quite funny, believe it or not. Now, if you are ready to commit a little bit of money for a relatively low monthly fee, you can get into Helicopter Online Ground School. I've got a link here, tinyurl.com/hogs discount, all one word, which is HOGS discount. And when you get in there, you can put in HTV10 into the discount code at the checkout, and that'll get you a 10% off. They have a 24-hour free trial and then 30-day, no questions, money back. So you've got really nothing to lose. That'll really help you get ahead if you want to do that. Get your ground school started before you actually get to the flight school. And like I said, flight schools are generally charging about somewhere between $40, $60, maybe even $80 per hour for ground. So it's a pretty low cost investment to kind of reduce your ground training. Helicopter Online Ground School also has a bunch of free resources, including a book called Private Pilot 101, which covers a lot of the subjects that we've been talking about today from Kenneth's point of view. What pilot supplies do you need to get started? As already mentioned, hold off on making any big purchases until you're fully committed, but let's assume that you're ready to go. I've put together a web page with a comprehensive list of all the essential supplies for new pilots. This includes things like pre-flight tools, headsets, knee boards, navigation equipment, basic books, and more. A full list of everything you'll need to get started. The page also features supplies for career pilots, things you might need later on in your training, or equipment you might want to invest in early to get started with high quality gear. And you can find all this at helicoptertrainingvideos.com/supplies. The link's also in the episode notes. That's it. That pretty much wraps up episode 1 of the Helicopter Training Podcast. So let us know if you have follow-up questions or things that we haven't covered, or maybe you've gone through this process. How was your experience? Do you have any tips for others? Send it all in, either with a written message or recording audio at helicoptertrainingpodcast.com/contact. And all of the links that we talked about are going to be in the episode notes in your podcast player or in the description if you're watching this on YouTube. Watch out for the next episode, which will be covering how to hover a helicopter. We'll be talking about the aerodynamics, Why is it so hard, and some tips to make it a little bit easier. Tips for students and instructors, how to teach it as well as talking about the FAA ACS standards for hovering and more. So send in your questions related to hovering. Thank you for tuning in to the Helicopter Train podcast. So if you found this episode useful, please take a moment, rate and review the show in your podcast app, because those reviews and ratings make a huge difference helping others discover the show and grow the community. Please also just share the podcast with any friends or colleagues or anyone else you think would be passionate about helicopters. Don't forget to subscribe or follow to make sure you never miss a future episode. And we'd love to hear from you. If you've got questions, topic suggestions, or want to share your experiences, your frustrations, and your successes, head out to helicoptertrainpodcast.com/contact. Your feedback really helps improve the show, make each episode even better. Finally, if you found value in this podcast, please visit helicoptertrainpodcast.com/support. And there you can find a bunch of ways to support the show, both financially and otherwise, to help the show keep going. Thanks again for listening. Fly safe, and we'll see you on the next episode.